I'm Greg Giroux, a Congress and elections reporter for the Bloomberg Government publication in Washington. And on behalf of FMC, I welcome you to the panel, Rules of the 118th Congress. For the next hour, we'll hear from a very distinguished panel of 4 former members of Congress who are very conversant with the House's operations, its leadership, the Rules Committee, among other topics. The panelists surely are well known to you, but permit me to introduce them alphabetically by last name, just like in the Speaker's election, but I will not take 15 ballots or 5 days to do so. First is Doug Collins, a Georgia Republican who served in the House from 2013 to 2021. He was ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. He also served on the Rules, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight Committees during his tenure in Congress. Collins' first book, The Clock and the Calendar, was released in November 2021 and offers an insider perspective on the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Martin Frost represented Texas's 24th congressional district from 1979 to 2005. During that time, he served 8 years in the House Democratic leadership, including 4 years as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and 4 years as chair of the House Democratic Caucus. He was a longtime member of both the House Rules and Budget Committees. Frost and former Republican Congressman Tom Davis of Virginia co-authored the book, The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis. Ed Perlmutter, a Colorado Democrat, served in Congress for 16 years, starting in 2007 and ending 22 days ago. In the 117th Congress, Ed served on 4 committees in the House: Financial Services, Science, Space, and Technology, Rules, and the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. On the Financial Services Committee, Ed served as chair of the Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions Subcommittee. He has lived in Jefferson County, Colorado, his entire life. And Bob Walker has 5 decades of legislative and executive experience. He served 30 years on Capitol Hill as a congressional aide, as well as a Republican congressman for Pennsylvania's 16th district. He was a member from 1977 to 1997. He chaired the Science, Space, and Technology Committee in the 104th Congress and served as House Republican Chief Deputy Whip to future Speaker Newt Gingrich from 1989 to 1995. He currently runs his own firm, Moonwalker Associates. Thank you to the panelists, the participants, for the generosity of your time. I have some questions for the panelists about the rules package and how it may influence the operations of the House, but I hope this is more of a discussion than an interview, and I want to leave ample time at the bottom half of the hour for any of your questions, which you may start thinking of and submit using the chat or Q&A function or by raising your hand virtually. There's a lot in this rules package that affects floor procedures, committee operations, budget provisions, ethics provisions, and maybe we can go kind of deeper in detail later, but I just kind of want to maybe allow each of the 4 of you to make some kind of introductory remarks about maybe your service on the Rules Committee and or your familiarity with the operations of the U.S. House. So,
why don't we let Bob first, since the Republicans are in charge now? Let Bob Walker go first.
Yeah, the Republicans are in charge, and we managed to get in charge for a couple of years before I retired. I'm somebody here who didn't serve on the Rules Committee, but over the years used a lot of the rules on the House floor to protect the minority. And so I have an intense interest in some of the things that the Republicans are achieving to do in this rules package, and I hope I get a chance to discuss some of the changes that have been made and how we can look forward to some real debate in the House these days.
I'm Martin Frost. I was on the Rules Committee from the first day I walked into Congress. I was put on as a freshman. Tip O'Neill was not excited about having freshmen on the committee, but the Texas delegation prevailed upon him, and I think he was satisfied, and I was certainly satisfied. I ultimately became ranking member of the Rules Committee for my last 4 years in Congress. It was an extraordinary experience, and I also had the opportunity to serve on the Budget Committee. My only cautionary note at the beginning is that we will try not to speak in technical language. There are some people on the committee who are obviously former members and understand a lot of this, but my experience is that even the members themselves sometimes don't understand all the technical language and the rules of the House. But it's a pleasure to be with you, and let's go to Doug Collins. He's the other Republican on the panel, and then go to Ed for some introductory remarks.
Well, thanks for being in. It's good to see some colleagues. And also I see Steve Stivers there. Actually, he and I served together on Rules Committee for a number of years in Judiciary Committee. My time in Congress, again, really what I found out, and I told members this all along, the people who know the rules can control, what happens. And the Rules Committee gives you that background. And so for me, seeing what's happening in Rules Committee now, it's sort of exciting. I want to see what's actually going to happen here. But also, I think as we're going to talk about today, is there potential for just some interesting alliances and train wrecks coming up? Yeah, there is. So it's going to be interesting to see. But I think some of this is getting back to something that I've said about Congress all along. And maybe y'all agree, maybe you don't. I believe that today's members, especially over the last 10, 12 years, and this is going to sound funny, but they're bored, because everything has been sort of moved away from the committee structures, subcommittee structures, and basically brought up to either the leadership level or House floor level. Rules Committee is the epitome of that. So if you get more people involved, you may see more member activity. We'll see maybe some better ideas, maybe more bipartisan stuff on a lot of issues. They'll still be partisan, but Rules Committee will be the flashpoint for that.
Ed?
Thanks, Doug. And I'm Ed Perlmutter, and I represented the suburbs of Denver for a long time. I served on the Rules Committee when I first was elected to Congress, and then for the last 4 years. So all the time the Democrats were in the majority. Doug, I think you're right, and that'll be an interesting conversation as to whether or not the rules open things up to every member, as opposed to kind of a leadership-driven approach to legislation. So I think that's really going to be the question mark. And does that result in, good legislation? Does that result in, nothing but a train wreck, as you mentioned? But it'll be interesting. And I think, for me, having been on the committee for a long time, I guess my ultimate conclusion is rules are made to be waived. And so even though we've got a rules package that really has a lot of specifics, when deadlines come, when the need arises, you often waive those specifics. So we'll see how that goes, but it'll be interesting. I think the composition of the Rules Committee is what's really going to be interesting and key to how the place governs itself. So with that, I'll yield back to our moderator, Greg, and you can get us going.
Yeah, appreciate that. All great insights. Yeah, I mean, kind of want to ask you, like, what are your most important takeaways from what you've seen in that House rules package, and what do you think are the most important things that citizens, Congress watchers ought to know about how the rules are going to influence the operations of the House? What do you think are the most important things here?
Let me start, if I may. First of all, the majority party has a 2-to-1+1 majority on the Rules Committee. The other committees are more closely divided. So there are 13 members of the Rules Committee, 9 Republicans, 4 Democrats. Now you have 3, shall we say, somewhat dissident Republicans, the hard right. And the question I have is, do they vote with the other Republicans on the committee? Or do they try and stake out a second position? Because the chairman, who's a very responsible guy, Chairman Cole from Oklahoma, has got to put together 7 votes to get something out of the Rules Committee. When you subtract out the 3 hardline conservatives, he's only got 6. And so this will be very interesting. Probably the most significant thing in the package is going to what's called cut-go rather than pay-go, and that when spending is increased, there have to be offsets to make up for that spending, and you can't use raising taxes to make up for the increased spending. We'll see how that works out, but that's in this package. Whether that's ultimately, if the majority party finds a way to waive that and ignore that, we'll see. But that's clearly their position, is that they don't want spending increases to occur without offsetting the spending cuts, and they don't want members of the House to use increased taxes to pay for increased spending. That's kind of my takeaway.
Well, I'll jump in. I think that there is an opportunity for a lot of opening of the debate included in these rules, but there's also the real possibility of dysfunctionality in some of what they have done. I'm not a big fan of the idea that there's a that there's a motion to vacate on the speaker. I think in this time and age, you have an opportunity there to tie up the House on regular occasions if somebody wanders out and decides to talk about vacating the chair and taking the speaker out. Now, the chances are that the vote will always favor keeping the speaker in, but at the narrow numbers that they have right now, that's a real open question. I'm glad to see the rules go back to allowing amendments, open rules that allow amendments to appropriations bills. I think getting away from that has stopped the members from being able to interact on the spending side, and that this gives the opportunity to amend those appropriation bills. In particular, I think what it does is it makes the ability to strike unauthorized spending back in order. Unless it's waived, as somebody just mentioned.
Might explain the unauthorized concept. You were chairman of an authorizing committee, so you were intimately involved in this conversation.
Yeah, precisely. Under the permanent rules of the House, you have to have an authorization in place. In other words, a policy bill in place before you can spend money on a department or agency. There are departments and agencies that have not been authorized for decades. That means that the appropriations for that, the spending for that is always under danger of people's bringing up the unauthorized spending portion of the thing. So that's a place where I think that there is an opportunity maybe to even get the Senate to understand that they cannot do everything through the appropriations process.
And Grayson, if you would make sure all the participants, all the people listening are muted until we get to the question and answer period. We will have a chance for people viewing this webinar to ask questions, but everyone listening in should be muted right now, and the only ones that can speak are the 4 members of the panel plus our moderator.
Yeah. I want to jump in here, and I think what Mr. Walker said, I think Bob said is right. I think the interesting thing for me, though, is going to be more, I'm not at this point as concerned about the makeup now, because there's always been, I think it is going to be an interesting thing. But remember, for the Republicans, the 3 new members who, more conservative members, but you also have Michael Burgess on there, who's been, and I served with Dr. Burgess. Dr. Burgess is a great member, but he's also had a lot of thoughts on opening the process up too. So it'll be interesting to see how he votes. And of course, a couple of freshmen that are coming on the committee as well. But one of the issues that I think that is interesting for me is you just brought up the authorized spending part. Just a note, the Department of Justice hadn't been reauthorized in 100+ years. Okay, just as an example of the issues, because we talked about this in the Judiciary Committee and other things. So this idea of not spending on unauthorized accounts could be a very interesting topic, but it goes to a much deeper issue of the correlation between appropriators and authorizers, which has really never been addressed. Neither party wants to touch that because of the jurisdictional issues between the committees. What I would like to see is taking this, if you're going to take this more open, the appropriations process, I know from 13 to at least 19, we were putting what bills got to the floor. We were putting 300 to 400 or 500 amendments. Some of them were blocked together. I think that's a good thing for appropriations, because we know most of those, if they're off center, are going to get stripped out in conference. But going back to regular amendments on regular bills, that's going to become the interesting part to me, to see what they approve on bigger bills, say just farm bills, say water bills, things like this. What kind of votes are those going to take going forward? But a remembrance as well is for the Republicans to stop a Republican bill. Remember, it's big bills are only going to come from the majority for the most part. To stop that, they've got to go over to the Democrats to pick up votes. And that's going to put some of these members in an interesting position to explain why they went to Democrats to stop something their own party was looking for. So I think that'll govern just a little bit, going forward. But again, I think it could be interesting to see how this actually plays out on amendments going forward.
I guess I'll just jump in on a couple of the other changes or not changes in the rules package. Bob mentioned the open rule on appropriations. we had that as Democrats when we were in the majority back when I first started, but, we were up to 1,000 amendments and it was just becoming Mickey Mouse. And we said, that's enough. Dave Obey couldn't take it anymore and said, let's start limiting this because it's just wasting everybody's time. But I think opening it up again is going to be interesting and I think appropriate. And it really does give rank and file members much greater say or a much bigger opportunity to say something. And so we'll see how that works. There is this notion of single subject that is raised in the rules package. I mean, obviously, we all had to deal with germaneness. That is really what envelops the single subject component. If one bill is germane to another bill, they can be tied together. They still can be tied together under this single subject rule in the rules package. It's a question of when you start adding and Christmas treeing something, we'll see how the Republican Rules Committee reacts to the Senate doing that, because that's what they always do. They pile stuff together, and that'll be that. The last thing was the 3-day rule. And Doug, we had that. I think the Republicans had that, and we had it. And it's still in the legislation to say all legislation must be available for people to read for at least 3 days before it comes to the floor. And that's a good rule, and I think it's an appropriate rule. There are deadlines and times when that doesn't work quite so well, but that is also a key component of the rules package. So, there are some standard things in the package, but then again, because of the tight numbers and the potentially very tight numbers in the Rules Committee, it'll be interesting to see how things proceed to the floor.
Exactly. Again, can I drop on something you just said? I love to see the other panel members talk about this because you hit something really interesting. The 3-day rule, 72-hour rule, whatever you want to call it, the most waived rule in Congress in the last 15 years. Okay. But if we got back to a more order system, in other words, you had the committee hearings, you had the subcommittee hearing, and brought it to the floor, more members would know that these bills are coming through and that the 72-hour rule is important. I think still needs to be there. But when you get bills brought straight to the floor, or you get bills that are constructed, from different parts, as you said, by leadership and then put to the floor, that's when the 72-hour rule really becomes an issue. But what about from my other, panel members, getting back to regular order? Wouldn't that take a little bit of this furor of the 3-day rule out if you're actually planning ahead and doing it through the regular committee process?
I'd like to add one thing, because I particularly want to react to what my friend Bob Walker had to say. Obviously, people want an open process, but that's not how things work in a body with 435 members. For those of you who are not intimately involved in how rules are written, there have been 3 types of rules generally coming out of the Rules Committee. One is an open rule, which means any germane amendment can be offered, and sometimes they even waive the germaneness. Second is a structured rule, which permits only certain amendments to be offered. When I was on the committee in the beginning, we tried to be reasonably fair, give the Republicans a certain number of amendments, give the Democrats a certain number of amendments, and make sure they joined the key issues. The other is a closed rule, which means no amendments. And in recent years, both parties have moved to having closed rules on a lot of pieces of legislation without any amendments being offered. In fact, there was a study, and it was printed in the Washington Post, January 12th, where it showed the movement in recent years had been away from open rules. And in fact, very few open rules in the last couple of Congresses, and more structured rules and a lot of closed rules. People keep saying, oh, it's terrible. If you have a closed rule, nobody can offer an amendment. Leadership, both Democrats and Republicans, sometimes decide the only way you can get a bill out of Congress is to have a closed rule with an up or down vote. Now, I believe this leadership is giving lip service to the idea that they don't want to have closed rules, but I don't think you're going to have a lot of open rules. I want to give one where any amendment can be offered. I'll give one example. My first term, we had a bill creating the Department of Education, which was a new department. And we stayed in session. It was a totally open rule. You could offer anything you wanted to on almost any subject. We were in session till 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 or 4 days in a row. And the leadership at that time decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And in fact, Republican leaderships have come to the same conclusion in many cases. They don't want to have an entirely open process. So the question is, do you have real, fair, structured rules with only a certain number of amendments, but making sure both the majority and the minority get to offer amendments that raise the key issues in the bill? I think that's the direction you're going to go in. I'll be very surprised if after a few bad examples or bad days that the current leadership decides they don't want to have totally open rules on bills.
But let me tell you, I was one of the people that was out on the floor trying to stop the education bill. And
No.
we started down 100 votes. In other words, we were going to lose by 100 votes. We ended up losing by 2 votes because of the debate, because a lot of people began to understand that this was not really about education, it was about a whole new bureaucracy. And so in that case, I really do think that it provided an opportunity for people to understand it. And when they understood it, it changed the dynamic on the bill.
Well, I do think that the current leadership may get burned on this issue. They may decide they want to have a totally open rule, and then they can't get the bill off the floor. It's called filibuster by amendment.
That's when I said earlier that it has a lot of room for dysfunctionality in all of this too, as anytime you have these kinds of narrow majorities, figuring out how to make it work is a really tough leadership job.
Wondering if I think members are ready for the more open and less predictable process. Do you feel like members are ready for more open give and take on things like appropriations? And I mean, should we expect more thoughtful debate that improves legislation, or do you think there might be some political gotcha votes that arise from this?
Well,
I'll tell you one area. I'll be brief and yield more time to everybody else. One area where the committee of jurisdiction hates open process during an appropriation bill is the defense bill, because there are always some people who want to eliminate this defense bill project or that defense project, and the Armed Services Committee is going to be very leery about having a real open process. Also, Ways and Means has been very leery about having an entirely open rule on their legislation, because people then attack one particular tax provision or another. This is where whoever mentioned it, I think it was Bob or one of the others, the current leadership is going to be feeling its way. They may say, oh, this is our objective to have an open process, but they may decide after experiencing it that they really do want to have it at least structured rather than totally open.
But you got a problem there, Martin, and I think that is that the very fact the current leadership actually opened up the rules process and others to do away with exactly that same thing. So if all of a sudden, and it's going to now, I think it hits the really discussion topic that we're at. If all of a sudden the speaker and leadership says we need a closed rule, we need this to be pushed through, we waited too long, now we got to get it to the floor, you're going to run headlong into a group in Rules Committee that have been frustrated, not only the 3 new ones, but also I'll mention our friend Dr. Burgess and others who have been very critical about last minute bills. This is going to be an interesting thing, because I think in some ways the old way, and a lot of us probably on this, this call would say, oh, I remember when we just raised the 3-day rule, we didn't know when the budget was going. The very essence of the changes we're seeing are coming from the fact that is something that's in many minds is not waivable. So it'll be interesting to see if the 3 new members, which I've worked with all of them, would actually work with understanding, or will this be a new process? I don't think it's going to be easy for leadership to do a touch and feel here. They're just going to have to go at it and see what it's at and then adjust as they go.
I think Doug is absolutely right. I think there'll probably be a test case or 2 where something comes up, and the question will be whether 3 or 4 Republicans vote no on a rule or vote to modify a rule similar to what the Democrats want. So it's going to make the Rules Committee a lot dicier proposition. It'll be interesting to listen to some of the amendment discussion. I think, where this kind of issue is going to really come into play is, let's talk about what has to be passed. The debt ceiling, that's coming up, appropriations bills, the defense authorization, and maybe the agriculture bill. I mean, everything else is kind of, life will go on, the country will keep going, but those are going to be very important bills. And that's where I think it'll be fun to watch the Rules Committee and see how they debate particular issues and see if they stick within the parameters that they set in the rules package.
Well, I'll give a very specific example. I come from a pro-defense part of the country, and a lot of defense contractors, a lot of retired military in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And there were some people, more liberal members of my own party, when the defense authorization or the defense appropriation bill came to the floor, who wanted to have an amendment to strike funding for a particular airplane made in Fort Worth, Texas, the F-16. And so on the rules committee decided in their wisdom not to permit that particular amendment to be offered. That's just one example. There'll be a lot of other examples where there'll be differences of opinion within each party. There may be some things that the Republican leadership wants to protect, and by not letting a particular amendment be made in order, even though there are a number of Republicans who will want to have a motion to eliminate that particular weapon system. It's not just to defense, but this is a real test of leadership of how they navigate this. And I think the Republicans are fortunate as they have a very able, experienced chairman in Tom Cole of the committee. And he's going to have his plate full navigating these particular kind of issues.
Yeah, I want to follow up with that. I'm so used to 9-4 votes in the Rules Committee, and under what circumstances might Republicans vote with Democrats in the Rules Committee? And on Tom Cole, will he have to form coalitions with Democrats on rules in order to move bills or structure debates so they can pass in a somewhat timely manner?
Well, I think that's a highly likely possibility, depending upon the issues involved. It is such a close margin that I think that there is a possibility. I mean, Massey is more of a libertarian than he is a conservative on some of this, and he certainly. Excuse me, Martin.
Yeah, new Republican member on the committee you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he's one of the new Republican members, and so that's a distinct possibility that you could have some division. The past performance of the Rules Committee was always that what the speaker wanted, the speaker got. This Rules Committee is going to be a little difficult to see that happening all the time.
But I'll give you another example, and this was earlier in my career. We had some pro-life Democrats on the Rules Committee who wanted to be able to have an amendment dealing with the abortion issue. And but the leadership always managed to get 7 votes and to not let those particular amendments go forward. I'm not sure that the leadership today could do that on an issue like abortion. There may be some people in my party who would like to express their views on this subject, and not necessarily in making it easier to get an abortion. And the question is, would they vote with any of the Republicans, or would the Republican leadership decide this is such a divisive dynamite issue, they don't even want it to be voted on? I think that is certainly a possibility. It's the chance of having coalitions across party lines is pretty difficult in the Rules Committee, because people are put on the committee to do the bidding, to carry out the program of the speaker if you're in the majority, and the minority leader if you're in the minority. And it's very rare that you have mavericks on the Rules Committee. This is an unusual situation. You have some potential mavericks this time, which may cause may result in some bipartisan coalitions in the Rules Committee. We didn't have those in the past. We always found out a way to make sure we had enough votes to get done what we wanted.
I always tend to look at it from a perspective of, like it was just said in the panelists, is the discussion on whose sides with who. I'm going to take a different tack here. We always tend to talk about the majority in this, and I think it is an interesting perspective. But I have all the faith in Tom Cole in the world to do most anything in Congress, and I think leading this Rules Committee is going to be something he can do. And a young member on there, Guy Reschenthaler out of Pennsylvania, is going to be very interesting to work with, because he's been on the Rules Committee. He's very sharp, and it's going to be interesting to see how he can build coalitions, because he is the chief deputy whip as well for the Republicans. But I'm going to turn it for a second. I think the most interesting player in this next Congress is going to be the Democrats. It's going to be Jim McGovern. Because, I mean, think about this. When you're in the minority on the Rules Committee, you're just 4 votes no, typically. You don't have it, it's really nothing there. But now all of a sudden, there is a possibility that he now could hold the key if there was something controversial that he knew Republicans were struggling with. Again, I think it's just going to be a sit back and watch for him to be able to play with the new members on his committee to say, where can they actually influence legislation? This could be one of the bigger, and I'm not sure this will happen, because I'm a believer that over time, except on some very controversial bills, a lot of this is going to work itself out. It usually does. And more, if you have 3 or 4 more amendments on the floor and people have to take a tough vote, that's just going to happen for a little while. But when it gets to some of the other issues, I'm anxious to see if the Democrats have a strategy for trying to disrupt some of these bills as well, that they know they can't stop on the floor, but maybe could have some influence in the Rules Committee with an amendment or two. So I think the Democrats on the committee, although normally on the Rules Committee nobody cares, on the minority on the Rules Committee, they might have to care on this one.
Yeah, Jim McGovern is the ranking member. He was a staff member for Joe Moakley, who was the chairman of the Rules Committee at one time. And McGovern has been around for a long time. He understands this. You've got 2 really able people in the top positions on the Democratic and the Republican side on the Rules Committee. But how they manage this is going to be very interesting.
Well, so I want to jump in there. So Tom and Jim are very good friends. They work well together. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be going in the same direction on this. And I think from a Democrat's point of view, and there are a lot of tough politicians on this screen, and you've all been through this, the more open the rule, the more, and this gets back to Greg's question, the gotcha question. The more open the rule, the more possibilities for gotchas. And the gotchas generally get the people in the middle. The more moderate Republicans, the more conservative Democrats are the ones that get caught up in the gotchas. And so the question will be, Doug, I think, whether or not there's going to be any effort by leadership to try and protect the more moderate members of the Republican Party, because at the end of the day, like it or not, we're focused on 24 and winning the House back. Now, obviously, there's work to be done. We got to get these must-pass bills passed, and Democrats will work towards that goal. But we're also going to be thinking about 24, and the opportunity to open up the process is going to give us sort of some angles to go after sort of the more moderate Republicans in this whole process.
I think, Ed, what you're suggesting is that some hardliners on the right may want certain amendments offered on the floor, which could be dangerous to moderate members of their own party. And will the Republican leaders step in and tell the hardliners on the right, we can't have a floor amendment on that because that'll be used against some of our vulnerable members in the next election?
Exactly.
Interesting question. I don't know how that's going to play out.
I'll tell you, interesting enough, for all of us on here, former members and all, we sort of think in these terms of hard votes and non-hard votes. I made not a mistake. It was funny. I've been with some groups of friends and just out in general listening and being on media, and they would ask me questions about what's going on in Congress. And I'd say, well, if you do this, especially some of the conservatives I talk to, it might be some votes that people, and immediately people out in the world, especially with their partisans on both sides, they say, well, they're there to take tough votes. Well, I get it, but there's elections to thank for. Ed nailed it. 2020. The unfortunate part about Congress nowadays, and maybe this is just a thing, is we're now a 2-year cycle of 2-year cycles. And it is more imperative on what's going to go on in the next election. And Ed hit it perfectly. Both sides have to hit that. And so this is where the interesting votes will come. I also, being been in the military for over 20 plus years of my life, I do believe that unit cohesion actually helps leadership in this. And if there becomes a real problem at Rules, you'll see a lot of members, I think, on the majority side, especially if it gets to where it's affecting day-to-day issues, that could be, family discussions in the conference, so to speak. I think that's where you'll see a lot of this.
Appreciate that. We got about 20 minutes left. Just want to remind everyone, if you have you have a question, please use the chat button in the chat box. I'd love to convey some of your questions to the members here, former members here. I don't want to get too kind of deep in the weeds on the rules, but one thing that a couple of my colleagues mentioned was the rules call for the return of or allow for the return of calendar Wednesdays, a procedure that hasn't been used by the House in recent Congresses, and which allows chairs of committees to call up bills that have been reported but have not reached the House floor. Could this mean that more controversial bills get to the floor, or is Speaker McCarthy in lockstep enough with his chairs that this won't yield many surprises? Would this really be used?
If I recall, they call them in alphabetical order. The committee's in alphabetical order, and they call agriculture, and agriculture says, no, we don't have anything we want to call up. Then it goes to the next one until you have a committee that wants to call up a bill. My assumption is that the speaker will have tight control over that, and that committee chairs will not go rogue against something if the speaker doesn't want a bill brought to the floor.
I remember back when we had the calendar Wednesday process, we didn't have very many bills that emerged under that, and it was largely because the leadership didn't want them on the floor.
Yeah, I don't think we ever got rid of the calendar Wednesday, Craig, but it just never is used. I think more likely, but again, a very tough process, and folks are familiar with the discharge petition. That still is a potential opportunity for 218 of the members to move something forward. But again, because leadership does control the calendar and can make it very difficult to bring even a 218 named discharge petition to the floor, it's not likely. When the export-import, and Doug, you can chime in here, when we did the discharge on the export-import bank, I think it was with the tacit consent of leadership of Boehner to allow that thing to move forward. But that's probably the more likely approach than the calendar Wednesdays or the thirsty Thursdays or whatever that we have. So.
Yeah, I don't think McCarthy's law. I think the speaker will have, in leadership will keep control. Remember, all the chairmen, still owe allegiance to the, and for lack of a better term, to the speaker. Okay. They do come through a steering committee on both sides, Republican and Democrat, but most of us who've had to deal with the steering committee or go before it or actually served on it understand that it is a process in which there is order to the chaos. And so committee chairmen, they may bring up bills that are sort of, especially if the whip and others, they don't have a lot on the floor that week. I think you could see it used almost in a suspension type format, that they would reward members for bills that they knew were going to pass anyway, and it may come up that way. I don't see it. I'm agreeing with others. I just don't see this being that big. I agree with Ms. Walker. I don't agree it, being that big of a change.
Discharge petitions, Ed, you mentioned that. I was going to ask if anyone on the panel had any thoughts about the use of discharge petitions in the 118th Congress are coming up a lot in the context of the debt limit.
It's an avenue, is to pursue the discharge petition. Just assume you'd get every Democrat on that petition, and you need, several Republicans, because it's just that tight, to try and bring that forward. Again, leadership really is in control of the calendar on something like that, but that is an avenue to bring something to the floor if, for whatever reason, the Rules Committee is paralyzed or leadership doesn't want to move something forward because they figure it's too controversial within their own caucus. So it's an opportunity, but again, leadership has a lot to say about when it comes up.
And I remember when there were some discharge petitions pending, that members would actually go up and take their name off the discharge petition. I think, as I recall, and Bob would correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the name stays on until such time as they reach 218, or until they get close and a member decides to take his name off the discharge petition. And it's been known to happen that the majority leadership will go to a member who signed the discharge petition and say, Mr. Member or Ms. Member, that was not such a good idea, and would you reconsider and take your name off the petition?
The tightness of the numbers between the two parties, I think, will probably keep discharge petitions from being very attractive. I mean, Martin's absolutely right. You can take your name off, and if something is getting close and there are Republicans on it, the team aspect of all of this will prevail, and people will be told that they need to get their name off of it.
So Bill Foster had a suggestion for our rules package a couple of years ago that discharge petitions, and apparently sometime in the past, your name was anonymous. So that leadership couldn't go beat up on Ed Perlmutter because his name was on a discharge petition. They wouldn't know it. And so that's, that's not certainly, it's not in the Republican rules package, but it's something that apparently existed in the past and, allowed things to move forward kind of regardless of whether you get beat up by leadership or not.
I want to give you all, well, I know we need to open this up for questions, but I want to give you all a classic example of how the process used to work. There was a tax bill a number of years ago when Rostenkowski was chairman, and he never wanted amendments to be offered. He always wanted a closed rule. And Claude Pepper, chairman of the Rules Committee at that time, and he was from Miami, Florida. And the owner of the Miami Dolphins wanted to build a new stadium using industrial development bonds. And Rostenkowski was dead set against industrial development bonds. He thought that was a ripoff of the taxpayer. And so O'Neill called all of us together in his back office, and he opened this meeting by looking at Rostenkowski and saying, "Claude gets his stadium, right?" And Rostenkowski said, "That's right." And that issue was resolved. Anyway, are we ready, Greg, to open it up for people to ask questions?
Yeah, please. If anyone on the line has a question, please use the chat box on Zoom. You hit the chat button, and it should open up a box there where you can kind of put your question out there. Or if you want to unmute yourself, I suppose that's another way we could do it too. I don't see the hand wave icon on my screen, but make us either send a message on chat or make yourself present to ask a question. While I throw out that reminder, I'll ask another one. We mentioned the Democrats in the minority party now, and this was alluded to a little bit earlier, but maybe you could expand on it. Could Democrats employ any of these new rules either to wreak havoc on the Republican majority or kind of form unusual, strange bedfellows political alliances employing some of these rules?
I'll be surprised. I think Democrats may try, but I'll be surprised if they're very successful, because this is where the team comes together. And I'll be surprised if the Democrats are able to force votes under these rules on some issues that the Republicans consider radioactive. We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility, but the fact is that the Republicans are going to be pretty interested in assuring that they don't do anything that does keep their majority from staying in place. The other thing is part of the ability to change things using proxy votes is now out the window. The end of proxy voting, which I heartily agree with, now means that the members will actually have to be there and voting.
I'll give you an example about proxy voting. The rules, when I went on the Rules Committee in my first term, every committee of the Congress used proxies except the Rules Committee. You had to actually be there in person to vote in the Rules Committee. And the chairman of the Rules Committee, Congressman Bowling from Kansas City, came to me as a new member and said, "Martin, a big part of your job is to be in your chair every time there's a meeting, because I can't ask you for your proxy. You're going to have to actually be there." Now, what happened with proxy voting on the floor was because of COVID, Speaker Pelosi got a rule passed where members could designate another member to cast their vote on the floor. And it had to, as I recall, it had to be in writing. And so you'd have, if people were sick or if the weather was bad, you'd have a number of members stand up and cast proxy votes for members of their own party. But that's now out the window. That rule was not renewed. People are going to have to be in the chamber to cast their vote.
Well, and in 1995, when we wrote the rules package, we ended the proxy voting in the authorizing committees as well. We forced And as a chairman of a committee where I had a 1-vote majority, that proved to be a heavy lift on some days.
But let me just put it this way, that Chairman Bowling made his point very dramatically, that we were to be in our chairs when we didn't care whether the Republicans were there, but we were to be in our chairs when the committee started.
Well, I would just chime in that, you know, I'm a believer, kind of like you, Bob, that it's better when people are together, the give and take among individuals as to the legislation. But I think the Republicans are going to regret at least having an opportunity to do a proxy or remote, because, you know, Greg Stubbe fell off the roof. Okay, he's going to be convalescing for a long time. George Santos is under the gun. You know, who knows what's going to happen with him, but eventually what is already a very narrow number is shrinking, potentially shrinking, and the ability to conduct business is going to be difficult. And, you know, we found that, you know, the proxy voting and the remote voting, maybe some people abused it, but generally it was when it was needed. But, you know, it's been revoked. And I guess I was going to ask, I don't know what happened we made some changes as Democrats to the motion to recommit. I don't know if the Republicans restored that, Doug, to have a full debate on the motion to recommit, because we limited debate on the motion to recommit, but I didn't see that in the package.
I'll be honest, I didn't go back and look, but yeah, I would definitely expected y'all to do that when y'all took over in 19, because we were winning a lot of motions to recommit, and y'all never did. And it was just a really interesting way that would play it out. But I would say that I would think they would bring it back. I'd have to check. I apologize, I didn't read that far along. I want to say one thing about proxy voting, and I agree with Ed on this a little bit. If it's specific reason, valid sickness or valid, you know, a funeral or something like that. But when you had 150, 200 members not voting on any regular week, when you had people, you know, literally calling in to committee meetings from their boat, I mean, this is what did a bad turn for proxy voting and took away exactly what you talked about. Greg Stubbe is a dear friend of mine, and he's not going to be able to be there for a while. That puts the Republican majority at no controversial bills, that's for sure, if they can't get 3 or 4 votes. So, you know, if it could have been limited to say here, this, and also for a shorter duration of time, when it lasted over 2 Congresses, I think that just got a little bit ridiculous. And I think just, you know, it's one of those things. One, you know, these instances ruin it for everybody else. And, you know, they could have been a way to fix it for like a Stubbe or like somebody who had a legitimate, you know, I won't even say doctor's excuse. Here's how you do it. But again, I think doing away with it probably now is just going to have to be the best way.
Greg, one of the things that I was looking for when I read this rules package was was the Republican leadership going to continue the term limits for committee chairs? And I didn't see anything in the rules package that changed that. So you all have a 3-term term limit for someone to be a committee chair, and they count when they're ranking members in the minority as part of those 3 terms. That has caused some members in both parties not to run for re-election when they are termed out as a committee chair. Now, you can have somebody who serves as a committee chair for 20 or 30 years and who's clearly not up to the job anymore. I'm not talking about that. But the arbitrary 3-term limit on being a committee chair has caused some members who from potentially vulnerable districts to retire. But I didn't see that in the package, so I assume that
it wouldn't.
Republicans.
Martin, I don't think that would have been in. I don't think that's in a caucus package. That's not in the House rules package. That's in the caucus package because we never applied to Democrats.
Okay.
Because
but
Democrats,
but y'all never changed it. You
in our House,
it
no, but they still give exemptions, and I think you'll still see some exemptions. I think, in fact, I think Virginia Fox actually got an exemption this year to be chairman of Ed Workforce. So yeah, I think it's still there. It's a case by case basis. Does it cause some situations? Yes. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but maybe in the longer term they may need to look at it. My biggest concern, I was a ranking member, is I never understood, you know, why ranking member status and chairmanship had to the account is equal. You know, I get it that you're leading, but as you, all of us on this call know, a minority member in the House Representative is nowhere close to a chairman of a majority. And so I think that was some of the conversation that'll be had, I think, in the years to come in the Republican side. is to say, do you really want to take somebody who does 3 or 2 terms as a ranking member and then only get 1 term to do a chairmanship? I think that would be a real problem.
Yeah, Kay Granger from Texas would be an example of.
Kay's another one. Yes.
Yeah, served as a ranking member. She now has 1 term as chair, but that may be it for her then.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes to go. I just want to make one last call for questions. If anyone on the watching has a question, please feel free to type it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it. I've got a couple left, and then we go to kind of closing thoughts. But again, I don't want to go too far in the weeds here, but I want to see if anyone had any thoughts about any of the budget, any things in the rules package that affect budget procedures. You've got reinstating what are known as cut as you go or cut go rules that require mandatory spending provisions to be offset or not add to the deficit. The 3/5 supermajority for a measure that includes an income tax increase. The Gephardt, repealing the so-called Gephardt rule. Again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but maybe generally or specifically, does anyone have any thoughts about how the rules affect any of the provisions related to budgeting?
Yeah, my guess is that that's going to be one of the places where the Republicans are going to really stick together. There's a lot of other things here, but I'm the former vice chairman of the budget committee. And one of the ways we were able to get the budget passed and ultimately to balance the budget in the late 90s was because that's one place where the Republicans have a fair degree of unanimity. And my guess is that all of that language is to encourage the march toward something that requires a balanced budget.
This is all very technical, and I don't think we can, in 5 minutes, discuss everything dealing with the changes in the budget process. But the real question is, Bob, as to whether y'all can pass a budget. Because if you try and if you keep talking about making cuts in Social Security or Medicare, you may have a number of people on your own side say, I'm not going to vote for that.
My guess is that those aren't going to be touched. I mean, what we were able to do back in the 90s, and that may serve as a model, it may not, was we didn't cut Social Security and Medicare.
Absolutely.
We, in fact, expanded healthcare research in a number of areas like that, but we put some pretty severe caps on other programs at their current level of spending. So, I mean, there are some examples of things you can do without getting into cuts in Social Security and Medicare.
But some of your members keep talking about that, about doing that.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, again, you go back and forth. I can cite members on, again, this is a whole different debate outside of rules committee, because I mean, but we got members on both sides who say a lot of things. But I mean, when you want to get into deep budget and appropriations issues, you're going to have to deal with the whole budget. And it's sort of interesting that we only still deal with discretionary spending. But I mean, again, I don't think it's going to be touched this year. I think you're right. I think it's going to be an issue that you're going to try and get as much continuity as you can between a body that has a House, but is at odds with the other 2 parts of that being the Senate and the president. So it's just going to be interesting. Rules committee, again, it'll be interesting to see how that affects rules committee. I think some of your more interesting rule or amendment allowances will come there. I have one last thing, though, that I would like to throw out to the panel and even to the audience members of what you think. I'll propose, and Congressman Stivers, William, Steve, and others, I propose that if you had an amendment for Rules Committee, you had to come and testify on your amendment. I wanted to see that. My chairman session, none of us didn't want to do that. But I thought, you know, it's too many times members of Congress either allow amendments to be put in their name or even bills to be put in their name, and they never even testify or talk about their own bills. I mean, you talk about wanting to change the process. If you have an amendment in Rules Committee, you ought to come and have to sit before the majority and the minority and answer questions about that amendment as to why it should get on the floor. It just shouldn't be allowed to be put in the amendment to the rules package and say, oh yeah, well, we like so-and-so, we're going to put his amendment on the floor or her amendment on the floor. That needs to change.
Well, there'll be some more late night sessions. I never objected to the late night sessions. Some of my
Nope.
colleagues did, but those will make lengthy sessions in the Rules Committee.
Yep.
No, you're right, Doug. I think my first 4 years, we had to show up if we had an amendment and testify about it. After that, it became pretty staff driven, actually, as to what was accepted or what could go to the floor. I was thinking about one of the things, the gotcha stuff, and one of the places that leadership can avoid the gotcha kinds of votes is to package them in block or whatever we call that thing, and have it be part of a whole bunch of amendments that probably are going to go down or vote yes or whatever. So that would be a way for the Rules Committee is to help leadership put things in packages in terms of lots of amendments. So thanks.
Yeah, we've hit noon, but I did want to give any of the forum members just one more opportunity for any closing thoughts before we close. Emphasize final closing thoughts or make some points that haven't been made yet. The floor is yours.
Well, I think
Anyone
we've
like to chime
covered
in?
as much as we can, but we've only scratched the surface. You know, you can only do so much in 1 hour, and you can't get into too much of a technical discussion because it's very hard for even people who are currently members of Congress to follow some of the technicalities under the rules. I will tell you one thing. When I got on the committee, Dick Bowling had become chair, and Bowling was often asked, why did he want to be on the Rules Committee? And his answer was, there needs to be at least one liberal who understands the rules. And in fact, that was his role. He understood the rules, whereas a lot of the more liberal members of my own party didn't understand them and couldn't get things done. I have a feeling there's some Republicans who feel the same way, and that there are some Republican members who may not fully understand the rules, and they want to have members who at least follow this closely and understand what can and can't be done.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar. Really enjoyed it. Thanks to FMC for the invitation and for putting this on, and special thanks to our former members, Bob, Martin, Doug, and Ed for your insights, and much appreciated, and have a great day, everybody.